Good afternoon, everyone. We are thrilled to be welcoming back Dr. Gary Hylander to the library. Today, he's going to be giving his first Zoom presentation ever at the Nord Library today, and he's going to be talking about the Potsdam Conference of 1945. And that is a follow-up to his previously recorded lecture on Roosevelt and the Yalta Conference of 1945, which, if you haven't seen it already, you can watch on the library's YouTube channel. Gary would like you to know that he's alive and well, and he's thrilled to be back on the lecture circuit. So stay tuned for another one of his Zoom presentations coming up in December. All right, take it away, Gary.
Ready to go. Well, thank you, April. And I want to thank all of you for coming. We don't have any seats here. I can't believe it. And I know that all of you have been so bold that you have taken these masks and stuck them inside your pocket. And that's why you're here. And no one knows that but us in this room. And my goodness, 75, 80 people, you know, this is tremendous. And as April just mentioned, that this is a follow-up to the Yalta Conference, which we did sometime in the early spring of 1975. No, the Yalta Conference was in 1945. And today we're doing the follow-up. We're doing Potsdam in July of 1945. And in July of 1945, a number of things had changed on the ground. For one is that the Germans had surrendered in May of 1945, and I'll get back to that. All of you keep waiting and pay attention here. There'll be a quiz afterwards. And the other thing on the ground that had changed by July of 1945 is that, as you recall with me, you know, that at Yalta, you know, Roosevelt was there, wasn't he? He should have been there. You know, he was dying. But he's dead. He's dead in April of 1945. And Truman, you know, Truman was a new kid on the block. Great name for a rock group, don't you think? Hold that thought as well. You know, that he was a new kid on the block in July, actually. It was in April of 1945. You know, Truman was one of the least prepared presidents in the history of the presidency. He had only been president for 4 months, and in those 4 months, he had had only one conversation with Roosevelt, and that was a 15-minute conversation, which was rather general, rather bland, as Roosevelt liked to keep things. And Truman had no idea what Roosevelt's plans were for the post-war world. And here he is, you know, suddenly going to Potsdam in July of 1945. And just to little geography for you, Potsdam was a suburb of Berlin. It's like Brookline is a suburb of Boston. And the reason Potsdam was chosen is that it hadn't been bombed out, you know, the way so many German cities have. I'll come back to that. So Potsdam was chosen, and he's a new kid on the block, and very unfamiliar with Roosevelt's plans for a post-war world. He was nervous, Truman was. I mean, he was meeting, at least initially, two world-class figures, Churchill. But Churchill at Potsdam was out of the picture 2 or 3 weeks later because he had lost an election. And he was shocked at this. And he had lost an election to Clement Attlee. And Churchill had no part of Clement Attlee. He called Clement Attlee a lamb in sheep's clothing. How about that for a turn down? He didn't like him. He thought he was too weak, not tough enough. So Roosevelt is gone, dead. Churchill is gone. And we have Stalin, who was not gone. A word about Stalin. Several words about Stalin. Stalin was tough. He was the best negotiator there. He rarely spoke. He grunted, and he kept his pipe lit. And everyone knew that as long as Stalin kept his pipe lit, that he was in somewhat of a good mood. One did not want to cross Joe Stalin. So Stalin was a regular there. He knew what he wanted. Churchill was gone. And as I said, Truman was brand new. And he'd only had a few weeks to study his briefing books. And did he study them? He felt nervous. He felt inadequate. I am meeting for the first time 2 world-class figures, Stalin and Churchill, who was relieved shortly. Stalin told Churchill, and Stalin could get away with this. He told Stalin, even though you've lost an election, so what? Refuse to leave. You've been here since the beginning of the war. You don't have to accept the voting of the public. And Churchill said, well, I have to. This is democracy. And Stalin, do what I do. I shoot my enemies, and we don't hold elections. Different man altogether. We'll see where all this thinking goes in a matter of months. Number of questions that had to be addressed at Potsdam. And these were some questions that hadn't been fully resolved at Yalta. You see, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all believed that there would be several wartime conferences, and there were not. This is the second wartime conference with the big three. The first one had been at Yalta, and now the situation on the ground has changed. Germany has surrendered. So what do we need to talk about today? This morning, right? Yeah, it is this morning. Thank you, all of you, for getting up so early. I'm really pleased that you're so proud to meet me this early in the morning. It's only 9 a.m., but you're all here. And nobody brought me a cup of coffee. Shame on you. Or a donut. Shame on you twice. We have to talk about surrender terms for Germany. We'll get to that in a moment. We have to, don't let me forget where I'm going. We need to talk about reparations. We need to talk about what's going to happen to Poland. And we need to talk about trials. And these will become the Nuremberg trials. And we really need to talk about a decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We'll close with that. We're not going to close anytime soon. So Germany had formally surrendered in May of 1945. Hitler is dead. He took his life in April of 1945. And I always like to point out to people, without Hitler, now you can inventory this if you like. Without Hitler, there's no World War II. Write that down. Without Hitler, there's no Israel. You write that down. Without Hitler, there's no genocide. There's no Nuremberg trials. Without Hitler, there's no Cold War. Without Hitler, there's no division of Europe. And he, in a very negative way, was a major world historical figure. So let's talk about Germany to begin with. So what are we going to do about Germany? And there are a number of discussions on the table. Hans Morgenthau, who worked for Roosevelt and now working for Truman, had been Secretary of Treasury. And he had recommended to Roosevelt, and now continued with this recommendation to Harry Truman, that what we should do with Germany is divide it up into farmland so the Germans can never again raise war, have factories, an industrial military complex, I'll use that phrase, and wage war again. Roosevelt initially at Yalta wanted no part of that. And now at Potsdam, Truman did not want any part of that, nor did Churchill, replaced by Clement Attlee, for this reason. That if we're going to have an economic recovery of Germany, we need a strong, robust German economy, and we cannot turn Germany into, the land of hiding. Because if we do that, if we completely mistreat the Germans, after we did at World War I, what's going to happen is that there will be anger, and there will be a complete violation of the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I, and we're going to have a war situation again. Without the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I, there never would have been an opportunity for Hitler or the Nazi Party to come to power, and no one wanted that to happen at all. So we need to rethink how we treat Germany. And the way Germany was treated, or the way the Potsdam Conference set it up, is that Germany would be divided into 4 sections of occupation: a British zone, an American zone, a French zone, and Soviet zone. And in these 4 zones, the plan was, it never happened completely, that Germany would be denazified, demilitarized, and also democratized. Now that happened in the American, British, and French zone. And later on after the war, and we don't have time to get into this, maybe some other time, that these three zones of occupation were later on combined, and they were combined into what became after the war West Germany, democratic, denazified, and demilitarized. The Soviet zone was turned into East Germany under the control of Moscow. You know what Stalin did is when he finally returned to Moscow and at the end of the conference, at the end of the Potsdam conference, and boy, this says something, doesn't it? He put all of Eastern Europe under his control. 12 million soldiers, 300 divisions. He did not want to give up what he had earned, he felt, so in a very bloody and painful way, to protect the Soviet Union from another invasion from the West. You know, sometimes great stories are told in small vignettes, and here's a small vignette for all of you. That when Stalin returned to the Soviet Union, he put all of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany on Moscow time. That's the power he had. So he said, when I pick up the phone in Moscow at 3 p.m., I want it to be 3 p.m. in Czechoslovakia. I want it to be 3 p.m. in Berlin, East Berlin. So I don't want to lose my train of thought. Along with Germany being divided into 4 zones, Berlin was also divided into 4 zones of occupation: British, French, American, and Russian. And the same thing in the divided Berlin was modeled in a divided Germany. West Germany was a combination of American, British, and French zones, and East Germany was a Soviet zone. And life was tough in East Germany, and it was tough in Eastern Europe. See, what the British were worried about, and the French to some extent, is that at the end of World War II, that the Americans would replicate what they did at the end of World War I. And that was to withdraw and go back home and become an isolationist country again. Churchill, as long as he was there, and the French and Attlee, we can't do that. If the Americans leave, Stalin might take that opportunity to send his armies all to the English Channel and have a complete domination of Eastern and Western Europe. So we want to keep the Americans here. Truman agreed with that. By now Truman was slow to come to this. Initially, Truman felt that Stalin was a grand fellow. But after the word came back to him, that Stalin was turning all of Eastern Europe into a gulag, into a prison colony, he changed his mind about Stalin. And that surfaces when, I'm not jumping around here, but I'm assuming all of you have a deep and profound sense of humor, of history. Remember in 1948, the Berlin airlift, when Stalin tried to force the Americans out of their sections of Berlin and show that the American word is not to be trusted. When I challenged them, they'll get out of West Berlin. And if they get out of West Berlin, we'll get them out of Western Europe altogether. And Truman, who was a tough guy, he was tough. Roosevelt was not tough. Roosevelt was soft. Roosevelt at times was like a marshmallow. He didn't stand his ground. He didn't lock his hips. And when Truman was challenged, he said, "We are staying in East Germany." And the phrase he used, "We are staying, period. We are not going to get pushed out at all." And now I've got Stalin's number. And he did. And he told the Russian ministers who came to Washington that act like gentlemen, and you need to be housebroken. Act like gentlemen. And if you act like gentlemen, I will treat you as a gentleman, or the Soviet Union as a band of brothers. So the whole German question became tangled up into politics, and it led to, as I said, the Berlin airlift in November of 1948. We're not getting out. We are not going to be pushed out by Stalin. We are staying, period. I've got Stalin's number. And also at the end of the war, the big question was, another question was, what about reparations? Stalin wanted reparations from all of Germany. And he put a number on it at Yalta, $20 billion. $20 billion. $20 billion. And Churchill and Truman now knew that the Russians had stripped all of Eastern Germany and much of their portions of Eastern Europe of everything that was movable. They already had collected $20 billion of material and in resources. So we're not going to strip Germany of its resources so that it can never recover after World War II and become a problem for the economic recovery of not only of Germany, but of the entire West. So you've got enough. The answer is no. That was a problem. You have enough that you've taken. Now, Churchill, when he was there at Yalta, and Stalin also wondered about, the number kept shifting around, the execution of all the senior officers in the German army, the German Wehrmacht, so they lose all their leadership. And Churchill was in favor of that. And Roosevelt was not, and Truman was not. We could not execute tens of thousands of people. We can't do that. That we'll never be able to resolve that problem politically with the German people. And that question as to how many people to execute, who's responsible for World War II? Hitler was responsible for World War II. By the way, if you want to read a book about Hitler, Joachim Fest, F-E-S-T, is a great read. So no, we are not going to execute thousands of German citizens. But we are going to have, and I'll get into this later. We'll say, April. Maybe sometime we can do the Nuremberg trials. Yeah, yeah, you'll like that. With the Nuremberg trials, we'll fill the room again.
Great idea.
Don't jump in my screen. Thank you. There's always someone who wants to hog the show, and I'm very generous with the show. I am. So the Nuremberg trials were set up to begin in November of 1945. The Nuremberg trials, I know you all know about the Nuremberg trials, in which we will identify, some of the major culprits of the Nazi regime. And these Nuremberg trials lasted, into the spring of 46 and 47. And 12 German high-ranking officials were executed. 12 were hanged. The only guy who wasn't hanged was Himmler. He got away. He got caught later on and brought back to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. And Goering, who took his own life. He had a little bit of cyanide under a false tooth, so he chomped down on it and took his own life. Hitler, for years afterwards, people were looking for Hitler. The feeling was he had escaped. He had escaped and was living somewhere in disguise in in Argentina or Peru. That didn't happen. He took his life in Berlin along with Eva Braun. He married her, by the way, Eva Braun, finally. They've been going together for a while. All right, he had finally married her, and she was patient. She was his hostess. And so they got married in April, whatever. And for his wedding gift to her, he said, can you imagine this? We will both commit suicide in the evening of our marriage. That'll be the first step of our honeymoon. Can you imagine that? And she took poison, and he blew his brains out with a pistol. And he had both of their bodies burned, so they could not be captured by the Soviets and hung in some sort of effigy. So with Germany, to dismantle Germany, it could not be a military powerhouse. To dismantle Germany, to denazify Germany, and to democratize Germany. Today, this morning, now it's 9:30, this morning, that still is against the law to sing the Horst Wessel song or to play Germany über alles, Germany over all, or to display the swastika. By the way, it just popped in my head. If you want to read a compelling book, a book that tore the intelligentsia apart in Europe and the United States, was Hannah Arendt. It was called The Banality, B-A-N-A-L-I-T-Y. I spelled that quickly. I'm not good at spelling, just like I'm not good at math. The banality of evil. Now, Hannah Arendt was covering the trial for the Atlantic Monthly. This got her in big trouble intellectually. And what she meant by the banality of evil is that good people can get caught up in a killing machine, and that you're more concerned with the railroad timetables to make sure that the railroads pass through at a certain time. I'll tell you this, even in 44 and 45, ammunition trains bound for the front were shunted off to the side so the trains could move through carrying Jews and others to the killing camps at Auschwitz. And she said, in the banality of evil, there's nothing strange about this. Good people can do awful things when they're following instructions and to make sure that the timetables are maintained. You want to read that book. It caused a tremendous uproar across Europe and across the United States that people are evil, and in the right situations to please their superiors, they keep the trains moving with X number of people on them, like X number of cattle. It's mechanized annihilation. A lot of history there. An awful lot of what we're capable of, under the right circumstances. The situation in Germany remained quite chaotic, and particularly when the Red Army, swept into Eastern Europe, and Poles, and fled, because the whole border of Poland shifted west, and so many Poles, many Germans fled as well to the west, and it created a mayhem, in Berlin and elsewhere. I'll come back to that as well. Do you know that 20% of the population of Poland died in World War II? 20%. Poland disappeared for the third time. The Habsburgs had grabbed it one time, the Russians had grabbed it, and now it disappeared again. 20% of the population of Poland died. Now, we've got about 300 million plus people in the United States. And do the math, 20% of 300 million Americans, to die during a war, and they would if that war was nuclear, that. Robert McNamara made a very careful case of that to Lyndon Johnson. So we've got reparations, we've got Germany. As I said, let's go to Poland. Poland just about disappeared, and it did disappear. Took a long time for the Poles to recover economically and politically. The situation, I can see them, they're okay. Maybe they're not okay. I don't know. You're welcome. We've got one more chair. We've got two more chairs. The war trials, as I said, 12 were executed. Hundreds and hundreds were excused from being executed. That in order to keep your job in Nazi Germany, you had to join the Nazi Party. There were at least a half a dozen right-wing parties in Germany, which wanted to destroy the Treaty of Versailles. Without the Treaty of Versailles, as I said, there's no Hitler, and all that followed. In order to keep your job in Nazi Germany, Hitler came to power in January of 1933. Roosevelt was sworn in the same year, in 1933. And in order to keep your job in Nazi Germany, you had to join the Nazi Party. You had to. If you wanted to keep your job as a motorman, if you wanted to keep your job as a postal employee, if you wanted to keep your job in the airport, directing planes in. I always find it interesting to watch, a young woman or a young guy directing these huge aircraft in, and they're standing right in front of them. Come on in and bite me. You had to join the party, and you became party member, 3,207,000, and you had to show those papers. And if not, you were fired. Now, Jews had no choice. They were gone. And many of the Jews of Germany left. They couldn't believe what was happening. We are Germans. before we are Jews. They couldn't believe what was happening. And there's so much literature on this. It's overwhelming. It's distressing. It's wrenching is what it is. So when rations became short in 44 and 45, that you had to show your party ID number. And if you had a low number, it meant that you had been an early follower. And that meant you had more access to rations, to protection, whatever. If you had a party badge with the number 2,207,000, you were stuck. You had to sell yourself, or you had to pay exorbitant prices for rations. The point I want to make here is that there were many people who were coerced economically, financially, to provide for their family into the party. And of the four occupying powers, the Americans were most severe in finding who these people were and then to put them in prison and to try them. The English were quite dismissive about it. The French were even more dismissive about it. The Russians wanted no part. Well, they wanted a few guys hanged, but they wanted no part of a complete wiping of all the German influence, or eradicating the German influence of East Germany. You know why? Because they wanted to identify members of the Gestapo, members of the SA, which were Hitler's private army, because they knew where the bones were. They knew where the people were, and we want to get rid of them so we can communize all of Eastern Europe, all of Eastern Germany. So they weren't as tough. They wanted to get a couple of guys. The guy that they wanted, Albert Speer, you may want to read this book, Albert Speer, S-P-E-E-R. It's no exaggeration to say that Albert Speer kept Germany in the war for maybe a year because of his genius at keeping the war going and economically, militarily maintaining supplies. An absolute genius at it. If Hitler had a friend, it was Albert Speer. And what drove their friendship is that both men were architects, and that Speer would help Hitler rebuild Germany. None of that happened, of course. Speer, rather than being executed, got 20 years in prison. If you want to read an interesting book, it's Albert Speer's memoirs, Inside the Third Reich. And the only part of his memoir that he cleaned up for his American audience is when he alleged with his German readers that he was part of an attempt to poison Hitler inside the bunker at the end of the war by dropping chemicals into the ducts. That part was left out of the out of the American edition. So Inside the Third Reich, the banality of evil, and Joachim Fest, a F-E-S-T, a biography of Adolf Hitler. There's so many of them. Such a wicked man. Wicked man. Driven. The Nazi Party was driven. Nazism was driven by its anti-Semitism. If I let you ask questions, I know you would, but I'm silencing all of you because I want to be able to get a few things done. So hold your questions, sit on your hands. I'm talking to you because I know you want to jump in. Sit on your hands until I'm done. So Germany, Poland, reparations, executions. You know that the Nuremberg trials are still on today, that they were scheduled to be closed, I think sometime in the 70s. And they weren't. They continued. And even today, every once in a while you'll read a newspaper article, where they find a guy who's now 125 years old, who was a guard at Dachau, and they bring him, you know what I'm talking about, and they bring him back to Germany to be tried for the Nuremberg war trials. And by the way, the reason that Nuremberg was chosen, it was one of the few cities in Germany that had been destroyed by Allied bombing. And also they had hotel rooms and restaurants. And furthermore, Nuremberg had been the site of the German rallies, the Nazi Party rallies. So what a perfect piece of closure to have the trials take place in the very same city where Hitler gave the Nuremberg rally speeches. And, you read about people. You read that people say you had to have been there to get the sense of the energy, the enthusiasm, that Hitler was popular. You know, if Hitler had died in 1939, he would, right before the war, that if he had died in 1939, today, he would be remembered as one of the greatest German chancellors, you know, with regard to reunifying Germany, rearming Germany, ripping up the Treaty of Versailles, refusing to pay reparations. I'll just say that and let it go. But the war came, you see. You know, it's a war that Hitler wanted. And the war had two objectives. One, to eradicate Judeo-Bolshevism. And two, Lebensraum, living space, in all of Eastern Europe and the western parts of the Soviet Union. If he had died in 1939, before the outbreak of the war, he would be remembered quite differently than he is today, for the reasons I've just laid out. Now, the next question, and this presented itself. It came dramatically, it came suddenly, and that is in July of 1945. The Potsdam Conference is still going on. In July of 1945, Truman received a top secret cable from from General Leslie Groves, that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested under ideal conditions, not battlefield conditions, scientific conditions. And now Truman, do I use the bomb against the Japanese to end the war? Now, one of the pieces of World War II to remember is that there had been, as the war went into 43, 45, and now into 45, that the volume of violence and death had intensified exponentially. It just kept going up and up and up and up. Civilians now became targets. And Truman, we need to end the war. The war had ended successfully in May of 45 against Germany. And now there was such feeling in the United States to end the war. Truman knew this, and he wanted to end the war. And an example of the war becoming more deadly exponentially, growing and growing. In March of 1945, Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the air war over Japan, ordered a raid on Tokyo and a raid on other cities using incendiary bombs, B-29s. And what had been happening, as Curtis LeMay had ordered that the bombings that these B-29s fly at 25,000 feet, and to minimize civilian damage and to destroy factories. But the factories were still producing. So what was successful in Germany, or had been successful in Germany, was now applied to the Japanese war making. And that was to come in at low level, treetop level, B-29s carrying hundreds and hundreds of incendiary bombs, and come right over at treetop level residential areas and burn them to the ground, because we can't hit the factories from 29,000 feet. But if we kill the workers, they won't be able to get into the factories, and that will limit Japanese war production. I mean, the United States outproduced Germany, Italy, and Japan by 300%. But let's destroy where the people live, and that way they can't get to work in the morning. So in March, Curtis LeMay ordered, and the pilots didn't like this because they felt we were sitting ducks. We're coming in at treetop level. Well, that's because we can destroy where people live, and turn all the people into human torches, which they did. A book by John Hersey, Hersey, talks about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a grim story. People turned into human torches, so they cannot go to work. And that's what happened, beginning in 1945. And the real death penalty was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th, August 9th of 1945. Truman got the letter. The bomb was ready. And went over to Stalin. I said, I think we have a weapon that'll end the war completely. And Stalin shrugged it off. I know. And Truman was surprised by that. Why would Stalin say, I know? Because Stalin's agents had penetrated the Manhattan Project. He knew before Stalin, before Truman, that the bomb had been tested successfully. See, I agree with my dad that the bomb had to be used to end the war. Initially, in my more liberal life, and I said, well, blah, 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 blah. All the Japanese needed was a couple of months. They were being starved to death. And the war ended. Now, here's the point I want to make. The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, August 6th. The second one on Nagasaki, August 9th. Now, that's only 72 hours. And Truman has been criticized, and I agree with this, of being so eager to use, he only had two, to be so eager to use the second bomb on Nagasaki rather than to give the Japanese time to figure it out, what had happened, and allow them to save face, if you will, to come to the decision that it's over. The Americans have us blockaded. They're sinking all of our vessels. But Truman didn't want that. See, Truman was a card player. He played poker. And he wanted to bluff the Japanese. I can take a city out every 3 days. And many have argued that if he had, and I agree with this, that if he had given the Japanese a few more days a week to figure this out, they would have accepted defeat, which would have been very tough to do. So let me give some dates to you. August 6th is Hiroshima. August 9th is Nagasaki. The emperor surrenders, much to the disagreement of the Japanese High Command, Navy and military. The emperor surrendered on the 15th. So we got 6, 9, 15, and MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender September 2nd in Tokyo Bay. So when things began to move, they moved quickly. And as MacArthur said, and the Japanese finally signed off on the peace treaty. As he signed off, he said, this is the end of the war. The Tokyo Bay was filled with American battleships. And as the Japanese signed the surrender documents, and MacArthur was a master at staging things. He had 500 American aircraft fly over all the battleships in Tokyo Bay. This is what we have on the water, in the air, and you have to sign the surrender documents. And we have VJ Day, Victory Japan, to match VJ Day, VE Day, Victory Europe. Today, or certainly 10 years ago, the Japanese were requesting that VJ Day be changed to VP Day, Victory Pacific. They felt that they singled them out. It was VE Day for Germany, really for all of Europe. And we're being singled out here, VJ Day. And that wasn't agreed to. It remains in the textbooks. It remains with me in my voice, VJ Day, Victory Japan. And many Japanese historians today, this morning, would agree, however dreadful and painful it might be to agree with this, that it took the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force a surrender. Otherwise, MacArthur was preparing an attack. 5 million Japanese soldiers have been redeployed to the Japanese home islands to fend off the American attack. We died proudly for our emperor. And as MacArthur said, this will be such a bloodletting, like nothing else in history, if we have to attack and invade the Japanese home islands. So Truman, VE Day, VJ Day, and his poll numbers were really good. His poll numbers were 91, 92%. Now they will, disappear later on when he has to deal with the relocation. And we'll talk about that someday, as America shifts from a wartime to a peacetime economy. And that was a difficult transition. And what Truman did know is that the Japanese military had adopted a slogan, when the Americans come, when the round eyes come. See, the war in the Pacific was far different, far more bloody than the war in Europe. When the round eyes come, the slogan was 100 million people died proudly. Truman had that. MacArthur had that. It will be a bloodbath, not to be equal anywhere in the world. So let's go in and see if Hiroshima and Nagasaki might end it. Now, Eisenhower was opposed to this, not because he had any sensibilities toward the Japanese, but he said, why use this terrible weapon? All we need to do is keep the blockade on another month or two, and they'll come to their senses. We'll starve them out, like we've surrounded a medieval castle, rather than having to use what appears to be this dreadful weapon. Oppenheimer, who was the lead scientist behind the Manhattan Project, when it was exploded, test exploded, he got up, dusted off his clothes. Everybody wore goggles. Everybody had suntan lotion on. They had no idea how powerful this would be. Some of you have heard me say this. And he said, today we're sons of bitches for what we've just done out there, and now we're going to use it against the Japanese. General Leslie Groves, who handled the military end of it, got up and took off his sunglasses, Ban Ray sunglasses, wiped the suntan lotion off his face. And what he said was, the war is over. We've got 2 of these left. We tested 1. We got 2 left. The war is over. They'd be liked. This is what happened. And we're going to drop these 2 on the Japanese within 72 hours. So Potsdam, Yalta, the big 3 will never meet again. Truman never met Stalin. Didn't want to. And Roosevelt never met Hitler. Did not want to. These are 2 enemies. 2 ferocious enemies. So that's our conversation for this morning. And now we're going to open it up to questions. So we can open it up to questions and see what question number 1 is. I like being framed here by the man. Do I look like Charlemagne?
If you'd like to ask Dr. Hylander a question, you can unmute yourself, or if you want to type it in the chat, I can relay it. I can relay the question on to him. We have someone asking, what is the book Gary just mentioned about Hitler?
What happened?
They're asking, what is the book?
Take your mask off. It's
there
not
we
necessary.
go. What is the book that Gary just mentioned about Hitler?
Joachim Fest, F-E-S-T. There's a new book out that just came out, the title of which, the author of which I cannot remember. It just came out. It's volume 2. I think it's $39.95, but you can buy it through Amazon. Just tell them that I sent you. You can get it for $29.95. But the one I mentioned is Joachim Fest, F-E-S-T. He goes into a lot of detail about the personality of Hitler. Talks about an oxymoron.
Hi, Professor Hylander. This is Marlene.
Hitler had these blue eyes. That when he fixed these blue eyes on you, he never took them off you. And it was frightening.
I think someone just had a question. I'm sorry, if you could just talk one more time.
Okay, hi. This is Marlene. Nice to see you again, Professor Hylander. I just wanted to ask...
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I wanted to ask your opinion about I'm sure, many factors of why the United States remained in Europe. Might one of them have been that they really weren't expecting the shape that Europe was in terms of how many displaced people there were?
Oh, that was part of it. That was all part of it. And the British did not want the Americans leaving at all for fear that Stalin would move across all of Europe. And see, these are different times in the post-war world. Truman was very different than Roosevelt. And you know what Churchill recommended for fear that the Americans might leave? He recommended all the captured German soldiers be rearmed, imagine that, and sent against Russia to kick them out of Eastern Germany. That was impossible for overnight Uncle Joe Stalin to become the enemy again. It was a difficult time. And there were so many hard questions to answer. And Truman, who had failed at everything he had done, everything, And now he's commander-in-chief of the free world. And to make these decisions over whiskey, which he liked, playing cards with his buddies from Missouri. He always called it Missouri. Yeah, we had to stay. We could not retreat. Retreat in 1918, 1919 had led to Hitler, had led to another war. And the next one will be even worse. I mean, 2 world wars in 25 years, 1 and 2, and another one was unfathomable. Good question, thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. We have a question from Tom. He asks, to what extent did the decisions made at the Potsdam begin at the Cold War?
When does the Cold War start? Is that the intent here?
To what extent did the decisions made at Potsdam begin during the Cold War?
I'll tell you when the Cold War started. I'll give you a date, I'll give you a time, I'll give you an announcement. Churchill's out of office. Harry Truman had invited Winston Churchill to Fulton, Missouri to give a speech and to be awarded a PhD. And you can read the speech. And it will be Churchill who will talk about an iron curtain. You know, the first draft had been an iron fence, but that wasn't dramatic enough for Churchill, who loved words. You know, words are muscles. Words can inspire, words can hurt. And words are like fists or a soft hand. And it will be Churchill who will talk about an iron curtain descending across all of Eastern Europe. Stalin thought that was a very militaristic phrase. And now I have to watch my step, because Churchill could still move public opinion. Churchill will come back one more time as prime minister, but it's in the 50s. So from my view, it's that speech set in motion or helped to clarify the issues of the Cold War. Read the speech, because Churchill talks about all the capitals of Europe, and he goes on to list them. Boom, 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 are now in prison behind the Iron Curtain. And in order to protect the economic, you didn't ask me this, but I'm dropping in right now. In order to protect the economic recovery of Germany and all of Western Europe, the Marshall Plan, which was $13 to $12 billion in American aid, stimulus package. How about that for a connection? To help the economies of Western Europe, particularly Germany, England, and so forth, to recover from the war. And they did. They did. Got something else here?
Thank you, Tom. Any other questions for Dr. Hylander?
When's it going to leave? We're done?
I think that's it.
Anything else
Yeah.
you want to add?
Yeah.
And I think-
Anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, we'll put a period on this, and I think I'm coming back sometime in around December.
Mm-hmm.
And see if we can connect up Potsdam with the Alta and maybe something else. And the reason I'm saying that is that this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And I like to do anniversary dates if I can. Any more questions? I have a joke, but I can't tell a joke this way. You've got to, we need it.
Good.
All right, I'll tell you the joke. See how it works. These 4 guys worked together for years and years and years. And they always had lunch together. And one day they're in the lunchroom and they're having dinner, and Tom says to Joe, he says, when we have lunch together, you're the only guy here who never complains about being married. All you do is celebrate your wife, you celebrate your marriage. What's the secret? You've been married 25 years. He said, well, there's no secret. We go out to dinner twice a week. Conversation, a nice wine, nice menu. We chat with the waitstaff. I go to dinner on Tuesdays. My wife goes to dinner on Fridays. Nothing here is copyrighted. I'll see you all soon. Thank you for your company. Be well, be safe, and see you around Christmas.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Good morning.